The Calderon Combat Institute did not build its training hall for comfort. The ceiling rose 40 feet into shadow, ringed with cooling vents that hissed every few minutes like the building itself was breathing. Cadets from 11 worlds stood in loose formation across the floor, each one wrapped in whatever their biology demanded: chitin, scale, fur, light reactive membrane, and every single one of them was staring at the same person. Private Dale Ferris stood near the back row, arms loose at his sides, and did not stare back. He was, by a wide margin, the smallest body in the room. Not the weakest. Nobody here actually knew what a human's limits were, not yet, but the smallest, the least armored, the only one without a single natural weapon grown into his frame. No claws, no stingers, no bioelectric organs humming under the skin. Just 2 arms, 2 legs, and a posture that suggested he found the whole ceremony slightly tedious. Instructor Vay Salin walked to the center of the floor with the unhurried gait of someone who had broken in 11 generations of cadets and expected nothing different from this one. Salin was crath, 4-armed, slate-skinned, with a voice that came out of a throat built to carry across battlefield comms without amplification. "Today's exercise is simple," Salin said. "You have 1 hour. Build a weapon using only what exists in this hall. No requisitions, no imports, no species-specific equipment brought from your bunks. What you make is what you fight with for the rest of the term." A ripple of amusement moved through the formation, not loud, not rude exactly, but present. The Velkari twins near the front exchanged a glance, and one of them, Riss, didn't bother lowering her voice. "What is the human going to build?" A strongly worded letter. A few cadets laughed. Not all of them. The Savrathi exchange cadet, Holt, didn't laugh. He'd roomed near Ferris for 3 weeks and had learned that the silence around the man wasn't emptiness. It was just economy. Ferris didn't waste motion. He didn't waste words either. Salin raised one of his 4 arms. "Begin." The room came apart into 100 small storms. The Velkari twins pressed their palms together, and threads of bioluminescent resin spooled out from glands in their wrists, hardening in the air into twin crescent blades that still glowed faintly violet at the edges. A Draconi cadet folded himself over a seed capsule from his kit, murmuring to it in clicks and sighs, until it split open and grew, impossibly fast, into a barbed lash thick as a thumb, slick with a toxin that made the air around it smell faintly of copper. Near the equipment racks, a massive quadrupedal Borlu named Theth simply tore a support strut free from a maintenance frame and began reshaping the alloy with bare strength alone, his hooves stamping a rhythm into the floor as he worked it into a warpick. Every weapon that took shape carried meaning. The Velkari blades were ceremonial, shaped the way their ancestors' weapons had been shaped for 10,000 years. The Draconi lash was grown, not built, an extension of the cadets' own biology made lethal. Theth's warpick was forged in the old way, by raw effort, because Borlu culture measured a warrior by what his body alone could accomplish. Elsewhere in the hall, smaller dramas played out in parallel. A pale, segmented Quoro cadet folded a length of conductive mesh into an origami-like lattice that hummed faintly when she breathed across it, building a net designed to short out an opponent's nervous system on contact. 2 Savrathi cousins worked together over a shared kit, one shaping the haft while the other coaxed a resin compound into a serrated edge, trading quiet clicks back and forth in a dialect that didn't translate cleanly into standard. Every species in the room had walked in already knowing, on some bone-deep level, exactly what kind of weapon their bodies and their history expected them to build. None of them had to think about it. The thinking had been done generations ago, passed down until it became reflex. Dale Ferris hadn't moved. He stood with his arms crossed, watching, the way a man watches weather roll in, not afraid of it, just noting which direction it was heading. A few cadets noticed his stillness and assumed it was paralysis. Holt knew better. Holt had seen this exact stillness 3 days earlier when a fire alarm went off in their dorm wing, and half the building panicked while Ferris had simply located the nearest exit, counted heads, and walked everyone out before the alarm finished its first cycle. There was a particular kind of calm that came from already knowing what you'd do before the moment demanded it, and Holt had started to recognize it as a recurring trait, not a fluke. It wasn't bravery exactly. It looked more like rehearsal, as if some part of Ferris had already lived through this exact scenario 100 times in his head before ever setting foot in the hall. When the last cadet stepped back, weapon raised or humming or coiled and ready, Ferris finally moved. He walked to the front of the hall, past the equipment racks, past the maintenance bay, and stopped at a stack of plain stowage crates used to hold spare uniforms. He crouched, gripped the edge of one crate's reinforced corner bracket, a flat strip of tempered composite about as long as his forearm, and wrenched it free with a sound like a knuckle cracking. A few cadets laughed again, quieter this time, more confused than mocking. Ferris sat down cross-legged on the floor, took the bracket in both hands, and began dragging one edge against the rough ceramic tile in long, even strokes. "What is he doing?" Riss muttered to her twin. "Sharpening," Holt answered before anyone else could, "like a tool, not a toy." The scraping continued. Back and forth, unhurried, the sound flat and unpleasant in a room that had gone strangely quiet to make room for it. Salen watched without expression, forearms folded, eyes narrowed in the particular way Krath showed interest rather than disapproval. When Ferris finally stood, the bracket's edge wasn't elegant. It wasn't glowing or humming or pulsing with venom. It was simply thinner than it had been, beveled at a consistent angle, clean enough to draw a line of red across a knuckle if you weren't careful. He held it low, point down, the way a man holds a tool rather than a trophy. He turned toward the reinforced training dummy bolted into the floor at the back of the hall, a torso-shaped block of impact-rated polymer alloy built to shrug off plasma scoring and acid splash alike. Theth's war pick had left a single dull scuff on its shoulder earlier, nothing more. Ferris squared his stance, drew the bracket back past his ear, and threw it the way a person throws something they've thrown 10,000 times before, with a flick of the wrist, a heartbeat before release. The sound it made hitting the dummy was not the crack of an impact. It was a thud, low and final, the sound of something burying itself rather than bouncing off. The bracket's sharpened tip had gone 4 inches into the dummy's chest plate, deep enough that the impact alloy's internal frame let out a small metallic groan as it absorbed the shock. Nobody laughed. Salen walked forward, studied the dummy, studied Ferris, then tapped a note into his data slate without looking up. "Record," he said aloud, mostly for the benefit of the recruits still standing frozen around him. Human cadet constructed a penetrating weapon from non-weapon material in under 4 minutes. Note for review: humans do not require purpose-built tools. They require purpose. Riss, the Velkari twin who'd made the joke about the strongly worded letter, walked stiffly to the dummy and gripped the bracket with both hands. She pulled. Nothing. She adjusted her stance and pulled again, harder, violet resin blade still glowing faintly at her hip, forgotten. Nothing. "The angle's wrong for you to get leverage," Ferris said. It was the first thing he'd said out loud since the exercise began. His voice was unremarkable, flat, almost bored. It went in at a slight downward bite. You'd need to lift before you pull. Riss stared at him for a long moment, then stepped back without trying again. "What do you call that?" Salen asked, gesturing at the embedded bracket. Ferris shrugged. "Where I'm from we'd call it a shiv or a stake, depends what you're using it for." Nobody had a response to that. The hall stayed quiet long enough that the ceiling vents cycled twice before anyone moved again. Salen lingered by the dummy a moment longer, four-fingered hand tracing the air near the embedded bracket without quite touching it. "On most worlds," he said, almost to himself, "weapons evolve alongside biology or technology, never separate from them. Your species appears to have skipped that requirement entirely." It wasn't praise. It wasn't quite a warning either. It landed somewhere in between, and Ferris let it sit there without responding. What Salin didn't know, what almost nobody outside Ferris's homeworld would have known, was that humans had been doing exactly this for longer than most of their written history could account for. Sharpened stakes driven into pit traps. Fire-hardened spear tips made from nothing but green wood held over hot coals. Entire wars fought with farm tools repurposed overnight because the proper weapons hadn't arrived in time. It wasn't a tactic humanity had invented recently for the benefit of impressing alien instructors. It was closer to a reflex baked into the species by tens of thousands of years of having to make do, repeatedly, with whatever happened to be lying around when the moment that mattered finally arrived. That night, a maintenance drone doing its rounds through dormitory wing C caught 9 seconds of footage that would later get pulled into a disciplinary file. Dale Ferris sat on the edge of his bunk, barefoot, humming something low and tuneless, working a thin strip of scavenged composite, this one pried off a broken storage hinge against the rough underside of his boot sole. He tested the edge with his thumb, nodded once, and set it aside. The footage was filed under habitual behavior, review pending and forgotten by everyone, except the one analyst who actually watched it twice. The bracket stayed in the dummy. At first it was a curiosity, something cadets pointed at when giving tour to younger recruits, a footnote about the strange, low-tech species that had joined the Institute's exchange program 8 months prior. Then a day passed, and another, and the instructor simply stopped scheduling anyone to remove it. By the end of the week, cadets entering the hall took an extra half-second to glance at the dummy before looking away. The way you glance at a closed door you've been told not to open, and then can't stop thinking about. Nobody had managed to pull it free. Riss had tried twice more and given up the second time with a faint click of strained tendon that sent her to the medbay for a wrap. After that, nobody else volunteered. It wasn't the weapon that unsettled them, not exactly. The hall had seen plasma blades and growing lashes and stone-forged hammers come and go. What unsettled them was the casualness of it. Ferris hadn't performed his weapon like a challenge or a boast. He'd built it the way a person fixes a loose hinge, mildly annoyed, mostly indifferent, finished in under 5 minutes and not particularly proud of the result. That was somehow worse. On the 7th day, a heavyset Borlu cadet named Theth, the same one who'd forged a war pick from raw alloy, stood outside the training hall doors for nearly a full minute before going in. When he finally stepped through, Ferris was already seated near the back wall with a notebook open on his knee, not writing, just thinking, the way he often was before drills began. Theth's gaze went to the dummy first, the way everyone's did now, then to Ferris. "You did not need to leave it in," Theth said. His translator software rendered the Borlu's low rumble into flat, accented standard. "You could have removed it, made your point and moved on." Ferris glanced up from the notebook. Didn't think about it, honestly. Wasn't trying to make a point by leaving it there. Just left it because nobody asked me to take it out. "They are afraid to ask." "That's not really my problem to fix," Ferris said, not unkindly. "But if it bothers people that much, somebody can just pull it. It's not bolted in." Theth considered this for a long moment, then walked away without trying. When Salin announced the next phase of training, mixed species triads for a breach and clear simulation, there was a particular kind of tension in the air, the kind that comes from people who have spent a week quietly recalibrating what they think they know. "Squads are assigned, not chosen," Salin said. "In the field you will not get to pick who stands beside you. Learn now." Ferris was placed with Theth and a quick, wiry Sevrathi cadet Holt, the same one from the dorm wing who'd correctly named what Ferris was doing on day 1. Neither of his squadmates looked thrilled about the pairing. Neither looked openly hostile either. Just uncertain, the way you're uncertain standing next to a closed door that everyone's been talking about but nobody's opened. "Stick close," Ferris said as the 3 of them lined up at the simulation chamber entrance, holding a softshell training baton that had been issued for the exercise, blunt, harmless, standard-issue plastic with a rubberized core. And don't wait for someone to tell you what to look at. Watch everything. Corners first. Theth grunted something that might have been agreement. Holt just nodded, already scanning the dim corridor ahead with the quick, twitching attention his species was known for. Before they moved through the first junction, Ferris crouched briefly and pressed 2 fingers flat against the corridor floor, feeling for the faint vibration that usually preceded one of the chamber's wall shift events. "Floor's quiet," he murmured. "We've got maybe 90 seconds before the maze reconfigures around us. Move now, not later." Neither Theth nor Holt had thought to check. It hadn't occurred to either of them that the chamber gave off any kind of warning at all before a shift, and the fact that Ferris had apparently noticed this on his very first run through the maze said something neither of them wanted to examine too closely just yet. The breach began, and so did the part of the story nobody back home would ever believe. The simulation chamber was a maze built from synthetic wall panels that could reposition themselves between runs, lit just dimly enough that every species in the building had to rely on something other than perfect vision. Sound traps clicked and buzzed at random intervals, designed to spike adrenaline and ruin concentration. 2 other triads were running the same maze at the same time, competing for the same objective: reach the center chamber and retrieve a beacon standing in for a hostage. Dale Ferris moved through it differently than his squadmates expected. He wasn't faster than Theth, whose raw mass let him plow through narrow gaps other cadets had to slow down for. He wasn't quicker on the senses than Holt, whose compound eyes caught motion at the edge of every junction half a second before anyone else's would. What Ferris had instead was economy. He never took a step he didn't need, never turned a corner without already knowing what his exit looked like if it went wrong. "Why do you keep checking behind us?" Holt asked at one junction, his mandibles clicking with the effort of keeping his voice low. "Because the people ahead of us aren't the only ones who can flank," Ferris murmured. "2 other teams in this maze. One of them's probably already circled around." He was right. Less than 90 seconds later, a scaled insectoid cadet with a pair of wheel-mounted stun batons came around the bend behind them at the exact moment. A feathered avial cadet dropped from a gap in the ceiling panel ahead, a pincer maneuver, the kind Salin specifically designed these mazes to reward. Theth swung wide and got flanked almost immediately, his bulk making him an easy target to box in. He was tagged out within 10 seconds, the simulation collar around his wrist flashing red. Holt held longer, weaving and feinting, landing a few solid hits with his own training weapon before getting cornered and tagged as well. Ferris didn't retreat and didn't charge either. He slammed his shoulder into a wall panel hard enough to pop its magnetic seal, disappeared through the gap for 3 full seconds, and came back through a different gap, entirely holding a torn-free section of paneling like a discus. He didn't swing it like a club. He threw its sidearm, low and flat, catching the stun baton cadet across the forearm hard enough to throw off her aim entirely. Before she could recover her stance, Ferris had closed the distance and tagged her collar with the baton. He turned, caught the avial cadet still recovering balance from the ceiling drop, and tagged him out a half-second later. The simulation ended with both of Ferris's squadmates eliminated, and Ferris himself standing alone over a beacon he hadn't even had time to reach yet. Salin's voice came over the chamber speakers, flat and unreadable as always. "Squad 3, low survival rate, high disruption value, noted." In the debrief room afterward, Holt sat across from Ferris, wiping disinfectant gel along a scraped joint where his exoskeleton had caught a panel edge. "Why didn't you use the baton when they flanked us? You had it the whole time." Ferris was working a cloth over his own forearms, more out of habit than necessity. "Wasn't about the weapon. It's about timing. The baton's fine for a straight fight. That wasn't a straight fight, that was a pincer, and you don't beat a pincer by standing still and swinging. You beat it by making them flinch first. Holt's mandibles shifted, an expression Ferris had learned over the past weeks roughly translated to skepticism. You weren't trained for any of this. Your planet doesn't even run neural sync combat drills. How do you already know what a pincer maneuver looks like from the inside? We've had war, Ferris said simply. Not with your tech, plenty of it anyway. He stood, stretched, and one of his ribs popped audibly enough that Holt's antennae twitched toward the sound. You're injured. Bruised, probably. Theth caught me with an elbow during the breach. I'll get it looked at. He did. The Institute's medbay scanned him that evening and confirmed a mild intercostal strain along with the beginnings of a bruise blooming dark under his ribs. The medtech, a brisk Calwin who didn't tolerate complaints, handed him a cold compress patch and a compression wrap with the clipped instruction. No high-intensity activity for 5 days, possibly more. Ferris nodded, took the treatment without argument, and went back to his dorm. Later that night, someone passing his door heard the scraping again, not the fast clicking of someone working a console, but slow, deliberate strokes. Holt, walking back from the medbay himself after getting his own scrape checked, paused outside Ferris's door and knocked. "You're doing it again," he said when Ferris opened the door, a half-shaped strip of scavenged metal in one hand. "Yeah," Ferris didn't seem embarrassed about it. "Won't throw this one or anything, just shaping it." "Why, you're injured," the medtech said. "Rest." Ferris considered the question for a moment, the way he considered most things, not rushing toward an answer he hadn't actually thought through yet. Because if I can still shape something with my hands, even hurt, then I'm not actually helpless. That matters more than the rib does, honestly. Holt stood in the doorway a while longer, watching the desk lamp catch the dull edge of unfinished metal. "Your species turned survival into instinct," he said finally. "The rest of us have to train for it." Ferris didn't answer that one. He didn't need to. The next morning, a notice appeared on the cadet information board. Reminder: unauthorized modification of Institute property, including furnishings and fixtures, is strictly prohibited. No names were listed. Everyone in the building knew exactly who it was for anyway. The bracket in the dummy's chest stayed exactly where it was. In the weeks that followed, something subtle shifted in how cadets carried themselves around Ferris. The casual mockery from the first day had quietly evaporated, replaced by something harder to name, not fear exactly, but a kind of cautious recalculation, the way you reassess a quiet stranger after learning they once stopped a bar fight without raising their voice. Ferris noticed it. The extra half-second of silence when he walked into a room. The way conversations softened rather than stopped, like people were choosing their words around him without quite admitting that's what they were doing. He wasn't flashy. He didn't carry a phase blade or a grown symbiote weapon coiled at his wrist. But somehow, without trying to, he'd become someone the others didn't know exactly where to place. That uncertainty would matter more than anyone expected 3 days later, when Theth, the same Borlu cadet who'd forged a war pick from raw alloy on day 1, was carried into the medbay on a stretcher after a routine gravity calibration drill went wrong. Theth's injury wasn't combat-related. He'd misjudged a footing transition during a low-gravity drill and come down hard on his side, fracturing 2 of the dense carapace plates along his flank. Nothing life-threatening, but the Institute's realignment therapy for Borlu carapace damage meant a minimum 2 weeks out of active training. Ferris visited him on the second day. He wasn't close with Theth, they'd barely spoken outside the one shared simulation run, but he came anyway, carrying a thermos of broth from the mess hall even though he knew Borlu taste receptors couldn't process standard nutrient flavoring. He didn't say much. He just sat in the chair beside the medical pod for 20 minutes, mostly in silence, while Theth dozed and woke and dozed again. When Ferris finally left, a younger cadet, a sharp-eyed avial named Senate, barely past her first term, caught him near the corridor junction outside the medbay. "Why do you bother?" she asked, crest feathers flattening slightly with the particular tension her species showed when uncertain. Theths never even thanked you for anything. He told 2 other cadets you were unstable. Primitive, actually, that was his word. Ferris shrugged, unbothered. I don't really need the thanks. He mocked you after the spear thing, called you reckless. People say things like that when they're scared, Ferris said. Sennett's crest feathers tightened further, an expression that read somewhere between confusion and disbelief. Scared of you. Ferris looked past her, down the corridor toward the training hall, where the bracket still sat embedded in the dummy's chest, untouched, exactly where he'd left it 3 weeks earlier. Not of me, he said. Of what I represent. There's a difference even if it doesn't feel like one. He didn't elaborate, and Sennett didn't ask again. The Institute's directorate, it turned out, had been paying closer attention than anyone realized. Ferris's cadet file had been updated 6 times in 2 weeks, additional psychological evaluations, supplementary monitoring logs, a flagged note describing his habitual weapon-shaping behavior as potential strategic concern requiring observation. He wasn't disciplined. He was, very clearly and very quietly, being watched. Then came the midterm rotation. Live terrain drills, multi-species squads, no simulation chambers, no softshell batons. Real ground, real wind, real consequences if something went wrong. Ferris was paired with Sennett and a cold-blooded Draconi scout named Avrash for a reconnaissance exercise in the Havorn Range. A stretch of jagged cliffs and unstable low-gravity pockets left behind by ancient tectonic disruption, chosen specifically by the Institute because it was miserable terrain to navigate and worse terrain to make mistakes in. Their objective was straightforward on paper: locate a signal relay, extract a dummy data core, and return to the pickup zone without triggering the patrol drones sweeping the area. Avrash took point, his heat-sensitive lenses sweeping wide arcs across the rock face ahead. Sennett flew short hops between outcroppings, riding thermal updrafts with practiced ease. Ferris moved on the ground, not the fastest of the 3, not the most graceful, but the one whose eyes never seemed to stop moving. They were less than 200 meters from the relay when the fault line beneath Ferris's feet gave way without warning. There wasn't time to scream. The ground simply opened, and then he was gone, dropping into a crevice that hadn't existed on any survey map the Institute had pulled for the exercise. Avrash dove after him on instinct, hands closing on nothing but loose scree. Sennett flared her wings hard, circling the new gap in the rock and screaming his name into her comm unit, voice raw with something that wasn't quite training-grade composure anymore. Ferris hit a sloped shelf of rock first, then tumbled down a second incline before the final drop went vertical. The impact at the bottom knocked the breath clean out of him and twisted his left ankle at an angle that made his stomach turn even through the adrenaline. He didn't move for a long moment after that, eyes swimming, one hand pressed against his ribs. It took almost 6 minutes for the pain to fully break through the adrenaline. When it did, it came in waves. He ran a quick check on himself anyway, hands moving methodically over his own body, the way he'd been trained to since long before the Institute ever recruited him. Nothing obviously broken in the ribs, though his breathing had gone shallow and uneven. His left wrist throbbed in a way that suggested more than a simple bruise. His ankle was the real problem, useless, swelling fast, already starting to discolor through the fabric of his fatigues. It was a strange thing, the way the body protected itself from its own damage for a little while. Back home, instructors at the volunteer rescue courses he'd taken as a teenager called it the adrenaline window, that brief stretch of time after a serious injury where the nervous system simply refused to process the full scale of the problem, buying the body just enough clarity to act before the pain caught up and shut everything down. Ferris had always assumed that lesson was mostly theoretical, the kind of thing you learned in a classroom and never actually needed. Lying at the bottom of an alien canyon with a ruined ankle, He was grateful all over again that someone had bothered to teach it to him properly, instead of letting him find out the hard way, blind. He laughed, not because anything about the situation was funny, but because of course it had to be a cliff. Of all the ways this could have gone, it had to be a cliff. Sennett's voice crackled through his calm, tight with controlled panic. "Ferris, do you copy?" He pressed 2 fingers against his wrist calm. "Still breathing," he rasped. "Ankle's gone. Might have cracked the wrist too. Can't climb right now." "Hold position," Avrash cut in, already moving along the crevice's edge above. "We're deploying anchor cable, descending now." Ferris coughed once hard and shook his head even though neither of them could see it. "Negative. Go for the relay first. I'll slow you both down if you come down here." There was a long pause on the line. "You're hurt," Sennett said finally. "I'm injured," Ferris corrected. "There's a difference. Injured means I can still think clearly and tell you what to do. Hurt means I can't. Go finish the objective. I'm not going anywhere, believe me." He heard the hesitation in their silence before either of them spoke again, and he didn't blame them for it. When the comm line finally went quiet, he exhaled slowly and took stock of where he'd landed. A narrow crevice, not especially deep, but steep enough on both sides that climbing out with one working leg wasn't going to happen by strength alone. The slope above him was scattered with debris, broken stone, half-buried mineral rods, and the rusted remains of an old geological survey post that had clearly been abandoned decades before the Institute ever built its training range on top of this terrain. Ferris began dragging himself toward it, inch by inch, using his good leg to pivot and his arms to haul the rest of his weight forward. Every motion sent a fresh jolt up through the ruined ankle, but he kept moving anyway, jaw locked, breathing through his teeth. At the survey post, he found what he needed: a strip of paneling pried loose from the outer casing, twisted wire from the corroded interior, a snapped length of antenna rod, brittle but still rigid. He laid the rod along the outside of his ankle first, then the panel strip on the inside, the way he'd been taught to splint a joint by immobilizing it from 2 opposing directions rather than just one. A detail that mattered more than people assumed, since a single rigid support tended to just become a second lever for the joint to twist against rather than something that actually held it still. He wrapped both pieces together with cordage pulled from his own survival pouch, forming a crude but functional splint, and cinched it tight around the ruined ankle until the pain dulled from a sharp scream down into something closer to a low, constant roar. He gave himself 10 minutes after that. No more. Long enough to let the worst of the dizziness pass, not so long that the joint had time to stiffen completely and make the climb even harder than it already was going to be. Then he started climbing. It wasn't graceful. It wasn't anything close to heroic, not the way the stories back home like to dress these things up. It was just brutal, repetitive effort, hauling himself upward one handhold at a time, bad leg dragging dead weight behind him, wrists screaming with every grip change, palms tearing open against rough stone until blood mixed with dust on every surface he touched. He reached the upper ledge almost an hour later. Avrash was waiting at the top, already extending a hand to haul him over the final lip of rock. "You shouldn't have moved on your own," the Dracani said, voice flat but edged with something that might have been relief. "Wasn't planning on dying down there," Ferris said through gritted teeth, and let himself be pulled the rest of the way up. They found shelter near a thermal vent half a kilometer from the extraction point. Ferris's ankle was stabilized properly with Avrash's field kit, his wrist wrapped tight enough to immobilize it, and a numbing compound applied to take the worst edge off the pain, though the swelling had already set in by the time they reached the pickup zone. Back at the Institute, the diagnosis came in worse than Ferris had hoped, but not as bad as it could have been. A torn ligament in the ankle, a hairline fracture in the wrist, heavy bruising along 2 ribs. 2 weeks minimum before he'd walk without support. 4 before he'd bear full weight at. Ain. He didn't argue with any of it. He followed every instruction the med staff gave him, showed up for every scan, used the crutch they issued him without complaint. One evening, walking past the training hall on his way back from a mobility session, he noticed something new sitting beneath the dummy with the bracket still embedded in its chest. A small handwritten note, taped on with a strip of cheap adhesive, clearly not official institute signage. "Nothing in human hands is ever harmless," it read. Ferris stood looking at it for a long time. Then he turned and limped back to his dorm room without a word. He didn't carve anything that night. He just sat at his desk in the quiet, thinking about cliffs and chairs, and what exactly it was that people had started to see when they looked at him. Recovery taught him patience, in a way the cliff hadn't managed to. Ferris followed his rehabilitation protocol the way some people follow scripture, ankle elevated whenever he wasn't in session, wrist supported in its brace, mobility drills twice a day under the supervision of a stern Calwin medtech who had zero tolerance for shortcuts or self-pity. The first week, he couldn't put any weight on the ankle at all. The second week, he managed a slow, uneven shuffle between parallel support bars. By the third week, he ditched the crutch for short distances around the dorm, though the limp stayed stubborn. Theth came to see him twice during that stretch, returning the visit Ferris had paid him in the medbay weeks earlier. The first time, he didn't say much, just sat heavily in the room's single chair and watched Ferris work through a set of ankle rotations with the same patient stubbornness he'd once used to forge a war pick from raw alloy. The second visit, he brought something, a smooth stone from the gravity drill yard, worn flat on one side by decades of Cadets' boots. "For the carving," Theth said, setting it on the desk. "Better edge than tile, I checked." Ferris turned the stone over in his hands, surprised in a way he didn't quite show on his face. "You checked?" "I had time," Theth said simply, which from a Borlu was about as close to an admission of friendship as anyone was likely to get. "Also, I wanted to see if it would actually work before giving it to you. It does. I tested it on a piece of scrap from the maintenance bay." Ferris didn't say much back, but he kept the stone on his desk for the rest of his time at the institute, long after his ankle had fully healed. Word of the canyon incident had already spread through the institute by the time he was back on his feet. Not the fall itself. Falls happened. Injuries happened, that barely registered as gossip. What spread was the part where he'd ordered his squad mates to leave him and complete the objective, then splinted his own ankle with scavenged junk from a 50-year-old survey post and climbed an hour straight out of a crevice on 3 working limbs. Cadets who'd scoffed at him during that first weapons drill, wrists among them, started watching him differently. Not with the wary curiosity reserved for something impressive, exactly. More like the careful attention you give something that has proven, repeatedly and without drama, that it does not stay down. Most of these cadets had grown up believing that combat readiness came from firepower, neural implants, technique, drilled into muscle memory through years of structured training. Ferris had bled and climbed his way out of a canyon with none of that, using a piece of garbage and his own stubbornness, and somehow that unsettled people more than the spear ever had. When he finally returned to the training hall, conversation didn't stop, but it definitely slowed. He moved carefully, the limp still visible, his wrist still wrapped beneath a support sleeve. Instructor Salin's gaze tracked him from the moment he crossed the threshold. "You're cleared for re-entry?" Salin asked. "Cleared yesterday," Ferris confirmed. "No restrictions except sprinting and prolonged weight-bearing." Salin studied him a moment longer, then gestured toward the far wall, where a row of inert combat dummies stood waiting, untouched since the term had started using live drills instead. Ferris didn't reach for a weapon from the racks. He walked past the energy prods, past the resin blade kits, past a tray of bioadhesive packs left over from someone's earlier project, and instead crouched beside a pile of bench slats stacked for disposal near the maintenance bay. He pulled one free, sat down on the floor slower this time, favoring the bad ankle, and began sharpening one end against the rough tile. The sound was softer now, slower, less of a statement and more of a habit. When he finished, the edge wasn't dramatic. It was clean, evenly beveled, the work of someone who'd had a lot of practice and wasn't trying to impress anybody with the result. He stood, weight shifted carefully onto his good leg, and faced the dummy near the far wall, not the original one. The bracket from day one was still embedded in its twin across the hall, untouched and likely to stay that way for the rest of the term. This dummy was fresh, unmarked. Ferris didn't throw the slat. He stepped forward instead, in a slow, controlled lunge, and drove the sharpened end forward in a straight thrust. The wood sank maybe 2 inches into the dummy's surface. No splinters this time, no dramatic echo across the hall, just a quiet, contained thunk. He leaned his weight briefly against the embedded slat, testing it, then murmured mostly to himself, "Good enough." Later, after the hall had mostly cleared out, Holt found him at the water dispenser near the locker bay. "You're not trying to prove anything this time," Holt observed. Andible's working thoughtfully. Ferris drank, then wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "Wasn't trying to prove anything the first time either." "Then why do it again?" Ferris considered the dummy still visible through the open doorway, the slat jutting at its careful, controlled angle. "You ever hear of a kid called Joey Bell?" he asked. Holt's antennae tilted, uncertain. "No." "American kid, rural backcountry, maybe 150 years back by Earth reckoning. Got separated from his hiking group at 12 years old. No equipment, no comms, nothing but what was in his pockets. Spent 5 days lost in the wilderness before search teams found him. Ate beetles. Boiled bark for something resembling tea. Sharpened a fence post into a spear to keep coyotes off at night." Holt's mandibles twitched, an expression that had come to mean polite skepticism over the months Ferris had known him. "That sounds like a folk tale." "Might be exaggerated some, sure. Doesn't really matter if every detail's exactly true," Ferris shrugged. "We grow up with stories like that, not because they're flawless but because they're relentless. The point was never the spear or the bugs or any of it. The point was that he kept finding the next small thing to do over and over, until the next small thing turned into getting found alive. That's it. That's the whole lesson." Holt was quiet for a moment, processing that. "You're still limping." "For a while longer, yeah." The following week, the Institute hosted an open seminar on interspecies combat doctrine, giving each cadet the chance to present one technique or principle from their homeworld's military tradition. Ferris hadn't volunteered. On the third day of presentations, Salin called his name anyway. "Ferris up front." Ferris stood slowly, ankles still wrapped beneath his boot, and limped to the small raised platform at the front of the auditorium. He took a long moment scanning the gathered cadets before reaching down to a standard drill chair set off to one side of the platform, the exact same model that had started all of this on day one. The room went quiet the instant his hand closed around the frame. He didn't break it this time. He simply set it down and sat in it, facing the room. "Where I'm from," he began, "we don't always have the best tools available when we need them. Sometimes we don't have decent ones at all. But we get taught early that adaptation beats equipment, every single time, no exceptions." He paused, scanning the rows of faces in front of him, scaled, feathered, plated, luminous. "Nobody's saying you should enjoy discomfort. But if you can't work through it when the moment actually demands it, you won't last long enough for the better tools to matter." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't pace the platform for effect. He simply talked about wilderness rescue teams who built stretchers out of fence rails and tarpaulins, about field medics who'd splinted broken limbs with nothing but broomsticks and gauze, about emergency volunteers who'd boiled drinking water in scavenged containers during disasters that had stripped away every piece of modern infrastructure they'd relied on the week before. He mentioned, almost as an aside, A stretch of human history where entire coastal towns had rebuilt seawalls out of sandbags and salvaged timber after storms tore through faster than any supply convoy could reach them. Not because anyone had trained for it, but because waiting for the proper materials to arrive simply wasn't an option the water was willing to grant them. Then, without ceremony, he stood, reached down, and snapped one leg free of the chair beneath him. This time he didn't sharpen it. He simply held it out and passed it down the first row. Each cadet who took it held it differently. Some turned it over with visible confusion, clearly searching for the trick. Senate, near the end of the row, ran a thumb along the dull, unsharpened edge before handing it back. "Still not as sharp as your first one," she said. Ferris allowed himself a small, tired smile. Didn't need to be this time. The room didn't applaud. Nobody cheered or laughed or even whispered much. They simply sat there, quiet, thinking, in a way that felt heavier than applause would have. That night, a chair went missing from the mess hall. The next morning, an avial cadet was spotted behind the arboretum dome, carefully working a chair leg against a flat stone, mimicking the exact motion Ferris had demonstrated on the platform days earlier. He wasn't the only one carving anymore. By the time Ferris's limp faded completely and the wrist brace came off for good, nobody made a comment about it out loud, but plenty of cadets had started watching him with a different kind of attention. Not fear. Not quite respect either, not yet. Something closer to recognition. The slow, grudging understanding that the smallest, least armored cadet in the formation had quietly become. One of the few people in the building nobody wanted to underestimate twice. The final exercise of the term was the kind the Institute didn't announce far in advance, because advance warning let cadets overprepare in ways that didn't reflect how real engagements actually unfolded. Instructor Salin called it field collapse scenario, a full-scale mock siege spread across the Institute's outer training grounds, every squad scrambling for limited resources, while the simulation systematically failed the equipment everyone had grown comfortable relying on. Energy weapons ran dry within the first 20 minutes, their charge cells drained by a deliberate environmental hazard built into the scenario. Bioengineered symbiotes, sensing the simulated danger spike past a certain threshold, instinctively fled their hosts and refused to rebond until the perceived threat dropped, a built-in survival trait that made them useless in exactly the kind of prolonged chaos Salin was simulating. Cadets who'd spent the entire term leaning on their natural-born advantages suddenly found themselves standing in an open field with nothing but their own hands and whatever scattered debris the terrain offered. Ferris's squad, rebuilt for the final exercise to include Holt, Senate, and a stoic Velkari cadet named Drassel who'd transferred in mid-term, adapted faster than most. They didn't have a forge or a kit or a single intact weapon between them 15 minutes into the scenario. What they had was a collapsed supply tent, several snapped tent poles, a coil of synthetic tarp hooks, and a working knowledge, drilled into all four of them now, whether they'd admit it or not, that the absence of proper tools didn't mean the absence of options. They used the tent poles as reach weapons, and the tarp hooks as crude grapples to cut off two rival squads' approach lines entirely, forcing them into choke points where numbers and improvisation mattered more than firepower ever could have. By the time the scenario's time limit ran out, Ferris's squad hadn't technically won the objective. Another team had reached the central beacon a few minutes earlier, but they were the only squad still standing without a single member tagged out, and Salin's after-action report noted that fact in language sharper than his usual clinical tone. Squad demonstrated sustained operational capacity under total equipment failure, the report read. Recommend doctrine review. The original dummy, the one with the bracket still buried in its chest from the very first day of term, was finally retired from active use a few weeks later, replaced by newer models better suited to the next intake of cadets. But the bracket itself didn't get thrown out with the rest of the scrap. someone in the Institute's administrative office. Nobody ever fully confirmed who, though more than a few cadets had their suspicions about a particular slate-skinned instructor, arranged for it to be removed carefully, mounted in a small display case, and installed near the Institute's main entrance, where every new intake of cadets would walk past it on their very first day. The placard beneath it was short, improvised, effective, human. Ferris didn't visit the display often. He wasn't the type to linger over his own legend, and by the time the case went up, he'd mostly moved on to the next set of drills, the next rotation, the next small problem in front of him that needed solving with whatever happened to be within reach. But every so often, on a quiet evening when the halls had mostly emptied out, he'd stop in front of the case for a minute or two. Not to relive the moment. He didn't particularly need to, he remembered it just fine, and it wasn't even the part he thought about most when he looked at the case. What he thought about instead was something closer to a quiet reminder, the same one his grandfather had tried to drill into him as a kid working summers on a failing irrigation system with nothing but spare parts and stubbornness. There is almost always something you can use if you're willing to look hard enough and don't mind that it isn't pretty. A broken chair, a bent bracket, a snapped tent pole, it didn't matter what shape the something took. What mattered was refusing to accept that the absence of the right tool meant the absence of any tool at all. That lesson, more than any specific weapon he'd ever built at the Institute, was the one he figured was actually worth passing down, to Holt, to Sennett, to whichever wide-eyed new cadet eventually worked up the nerve to ask him why a piece of broken composite sat mounted behind reinforced glass at the front of a building, otherwise filled with plasma blades and grown toxin stingers and alloy war hammers. Because somewhere on a planet most of his squad mates would never get to visit, generations of humans had faced down wildfires with garden hoses, rebuilt flooded homes with salvaged lumber, and taught their children that hunger, cold, and exhaustion were obstacles to be worked through rather than excuses to stop. It wasn't glamorous. It rarely made for a clean story. But it was, in the end, the simplest and most durable advantage his species had ever carried into any unfamiliar room. Adaptation beats equipment. Every single time.